While last month lawmakers passed and Governor Abbott signed into law the state's newly drawn congressional district maps, the battle over those maps has just begun in court. Groups representing Black and Latino voters filed lawsuits to keep them from taking effect. They argue the maps intentionally and illegally reduce their voting power. Gabby Birenbaum is the Washington correspondent for the Texas Tribune. She's been following legal challenges to redistricting and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
The state's prior congressional maps were already being challenged in court on racial grounds. How do the new maps differ in terms of, in particular, majority Hispanic districts?
Yeah, so the lawsuit argues that, what was wrong about the old maps and that had never been finished being adjudicated is sort of even more egregious here. So they say, for example, that in Harris County and in the Houston area, there's enough, Latino voters such that there should be two majority Latino districts. There was one in the old map, and there's still only one in this map. And the one that exists now is projected to go for Republicans. So they feel like that's not what they call a Latino opportunity district, where the majority of Latinos' preferred candidate will end up getting elected. And so that's just an example of how they feel like the new map in the Houston area elevates their previous arguments.
So from their perspective, essentially, the new map, just like the old map, doesn't reflect the actual size of the Latino population in Texas.
Right, exactly. And then they feel like the map drawers have done something that they've done in the past, in 2011, for example, and was one of the reasons why some of those districts had to be redrawn 15 years ago, which is that they've taken, precincts that are heavily Latino but low turnout and paired them with precincts that are majority white and high turnout. And so they feel like the goal there is to make sure that, if turnout dynamics hold, Latino voters, the district will elect a Republican either way.
Based on a previous Supreme Court decision, gerrymandering is allowed on political grounds, just not on racial grounds. Is it a difficult thing to prove in court?
I think it can be difficult, especially now. I mean, the makeup of the courts have changed so much, right? We still don't know what was going to happen with the original 2021 map, right? That trial never finished. But the Supreme Court in recent years especially has been really hesitant to wade in on map drawing. They did rule in 2023 in favor of plaintiffs in an Alabama case, saying Alabama needed to draw an additional majority Black district. But there's a pending Louisiana case at the Supreme Court. We'll see how they rule there. But it's a precarious moment, I think, for the Voting Rights Act. And in Texas, we're still at the federal level, not yet to the Supreme Court level, but at the federal appeals level.
So who's bringing this suit that's making this particular claim?
Yeah, so it's a few groups you might recognize, LULAC and MELC, for example, groups that represent Latino voters. And then there's some lawyers that typically have been involved in Democratic map drawing cases, in particular with the Democratic Party of Texas, for example. So there's a few different complaints that have all come together on this case.
One reason it may be a bit challenging to make this case, I imagine, is that, let's face it, anytime we talk about Latino or Hispanic voters as one block, we have to note it's not one population. We're talking about a broad range of nationalities who may lean politically, some left, some right, and some you can't really get a measure based off of any particular nationality. So does that complicate the case that's being made here?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I'll be curious to see how Republicans defend the map. And if they do raise that point that perhaps, Latino voters are not have never been the sort of monogamous voting bloc, but even less so now in an era in which, according to exit polls, right, President Trump won the Latino vote in Texas. So it's going to be, difficult to adjudicate these things. The point that the lawsuit makes is that when you look at over the last two elections, 24 and 22, at statewide races in these districts that Republicans have drawn that are nominally majority Hispanic, so about just over 50% majority Hispanic, that those voters have voted for in the margin of 60-70% for a Democratic candidate, but they feel like the districts have been drawn such that doesn't matter, right, based on the exact way the populations are construed and things like that. So we'll have to see. But yeah, I definitely think that's a point you've seen the GOP make, that Hispanic voters have been moving further towards the right, especially in Texas. And in some cases, they are, the way they've drawn these maps, especially in South Texas, they will be relying on, continued support from Hispanic voters in order to win these seats that they've drawn for themselves to make it easier to win.
Since you bring up President Trump, what impact have we seen? I mean, you mentioned the results of the 2024 election where he received a majority. I'm curious about his popularity right now. Do we have a sense of that?
Yeah, so what we've seen so far in polling shows that his popularity, his approval rating with Latino voters in Texas has cratered for the most part. I think the question for Democrats is, does that mean they're going to come back to the Democratic Party? And I think that's an open question, and that's going to be played out, in campaigns in a lot of these competitive districts, particularly in South Texas. But Democrats argue that Trump posted this high watermark, right, among Latino voters that Republicans could do worse. And based on the way they've drawn these districts, potentially it wouldn't matter, right? That, Democrats could somewhat reclaim that Latino vote and Republicans would still win these districts. And I think that's kind of the crux of their argument.
When we talk about, again, that sort of overarching category, the Latino vote, another piece in all of this, I imagine, would have to be turnout. Is it clear how large of a voting bloc we're talking about?
Yeah, so Latino voters in general, though Latinos make up, right, a plurality of Texas, when you take out people under 18 and people who aren't citizens, right, they're not a majority of voters. And then when you look at turnout, that even further complicates it. White voters and Black voters in Texas have always turned out at rates far higher than the Latino vote. When I've talked to sort of people who work in trying to turn out these populations, they feel like there's some level of generational apathy that, they have distrust for both parties, things of that nature. And so one of the, some of the Democrats I talked to do feel like, at least in a few of these districts, a potential way to beat back the map would be by increasing Latino turnout to levels that they saw in 2018, for example, when Beto O'Rourke really energized a lot of voters. And so turnout would be a potential way, I think, particularly in those South Texas districts and then one in the San Antonio area to potentially neutralize the map. But that would be banking on, banking on going against a trend that's been pretty set in Texas politics.
Well, let's drill a little further in specifically on some Houston area districts. Texas 29th, Texas 18th. They've long been seen as critical seats for both Latino and Black political power. From your reporting, what exactly do these new lines mean for those communities?
Yeah, so previously, Texas 18 was what they call a coalition district, right? I mean, between Black and Latino voters, they made up a majority. Black voters had always traditionally been the center of power there, and that's why you've seen, representatives like Sheila Jackson Lee and Barbara Jordan, who have represented that district over time. 29 was a majority Latino district, currently represented by Sylvia Garcia, that used to be Jean Green's district. And so what they've done here is they've changed 18 to make it majority Black. So instead of just being plurality Black, it's now about 51% Black voters. And then with 29, they've actually taken Latino voters out of that district. So while they've made it more Democratic, under the new margin, it voted for Kamala Harris by a bigger margin. It's no longer majority Hispanic. And so I think for Sylvia Garcia, that was a real disappointment. And then for some Democrats I've talked to, they worry that, when Sylvia Garcia eventually retires, that, that might not be a district that ends up going to a Latino member of Congress or electing a Latino because they no longer have the majority there. And so I think that's what Democrats are concerned about.
Gabby Birenbaum is the Washington correspondent for the Texas Tribune. Gabby, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.